Google is flexing its digital muscles on some Canadians, and now Heritage Committee MPs want them to answer for it. The MPs have summoned top executives to testify on Monday after the tech giant moved to temporarily limit news access for about 4% of its Canadian users. It's just a test in the event that Parliament passes Bill C-18, the Online News Act. It will compel tech giants to compensate media companies for republishing and linking to their content on their platforms. It's something that some experts are opposed to, including my next guest. Michael Geist is a law professor at the University of Ottawa. He also is the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce law. Michael Geist, thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So Google is throttling access to Canadian news for some of its users in response to this legislation. If this bill is passed in its current form, do you think Canadian news will just disappear from Google entirely?
I think it's a real possibility if we're honest about it. I mean, all they've done, I'm not sure that throttling is necessarily the right word. I mean, obviously, they've removed the links to some Canadian news sources for about 4% of their user base. But given how popular they are, that still affects quite a number of people. But given the costs associated with this legislation, the government envisioning that Google could be required alongside Facebook to pay 35% of the news expenditures for every news outlet in the country just for linking to their content, I don't think we should be particularly surprised that a company like Google would say, listen, if that's the requirement, if you link, you have to engage in that kind of payment, or don't link, they're going to at least look at the prospect of not linking at all.
So what's the compromise here? I get the argument against monetizing a link, but Google has built a business model on scraping the internet and recycling access to people's information as a way to become one of the biggest companies in the history of the planet, right? So it's not like this is a loss center for them. What's the compromise if monetizing a link isn't the solution?
Well, and we should be clear, it's not even just links, it's indexing content as well, which, when we think about the chat GPT and the emergence of AI, that's how these machines learn. And the idea that we're going to require compensation for those kinds of uses as well, not just reproduction, I think raises some real concerns. But I think there are at least a couple of options. One option is to do what I think most Canadians would expect, which is to say that if you use the work, reproduce it, you make copies of it, you're running ads against it. In other words, you're clearly profiting from journalists' work. That sounds appropriate to provide compensation. And the legislation references that. The problem is it then goes on to say, oh, and by the way, any facilitating access to news, any linking, any indexing, we want to see payments for that as well. And I think that's where it goes a step too far. I think if we're honest about it, the best approach would have been to remove this approach altogether and simply establish a fund. We see that in the Canadian cultural sector, a fund that says you're making a ton of money on internet advertising, contributing some back to journalism is appropriate. And had they done that, it would get rid of the question of paying for links, of press independence, of who's eligible for this. As it stands now, there are hundreds of broadcasters that are eligible that don't even produce news. And yet the government has set them up for some kind of payday out of the system. In fact, 75% of the money, according to the parliamentary budget officer, is going to broadcasters. It's not going to newspapers at all.
Right, but if you look at indexing, for example, and even linking, on those pages, when you type it in, there could be ads on those pages, like Google will make money off of its landing page and its splash page. So why is it not fair to seek a piece of that if you are a creator that Google is benefiting from by the way their search engine works?
Well, I think first off, we need to recognize what a link is. A link is simply telling someone where they can find the content. And the business model for many of these journalism organizations, of course, is to get that traffic back. Journalism organizations, media companies are actively encouraging this. They could opt out of the Google search engine if they want. They could opt out of having their content shared on Facebook if they want. They actively encourage their users to do so and Google to send the referral traffic back, because it's valuable. They get something out of that referral traffic, and it doesn't cost them anything at all. Google actually doesn't run any advertising on things like Google News. They do, it's true, on search, and clearly it's been profitable. It seems to me this is something there are benefits for both sides. But what's most notable to me is that this ultimately isn't use in the way most people would conceive of use. We keep hearing the Prime Minister and others say, if you use the work, they need to be paid for it. They're not copying or reposting the work and running ads against it. They're actually sending those users back to the original sources where there's the opportunity for ad revenue and subscription revenue. And to bring in that prospect of payment for links, which I think is so central to the free flow of information, I think it's a major risk, not just because of what it means for that sharing of information, but if we say that media companies ought to be paid for that, what's to stop so many others from saying basically the same thing? You're sending a link to me, pay me for this. And suddenly the kind of information ecosystem we've been relying upon gets put at risk.
I want to go a bit broader if I can. I mean, this isn't, I used the word throttling. Maybe that's not the right word. You said removing the links. And to be very clear, this is not website blocking. You can go to all these news sites directly and get access to them. But the fact that Google can do something like this, doesn't that just show the power and reach of these tech companies and send out, like they can change the algorithm, put their thumb on a scale in a massive, massive way that calls for some form of regulation and oversight that has kind of been absent to this point.
I think that's true. And I think in some ways it highlights how the government has taken approach to these digital companies has been all wrong, in my view, quite frankly. They've really looked at them almost like a policy ATM, where they almost encourage some of this kind of behavior in return for paying off on different policy projects, pay off on some more CanCon or pay off 35% of the expenditures for news companies. What we really need is regulations that stop some of that kind of abusive behavior. So that would mean privacy rules. We need stronger privacy rules so that the government isn't seeking, in effect, to monetize our data by paying off on different policies, but it's stopping misuse to begin with. And we do need unquestionably stronger rules when it comes to any competitive behavior. But that's not where the government's point put its emphasis. Instead of trying to stop, I think, the bad behavior, it's almost trying to profit from it with the money flowing out, whether that's to Canadian film producers or in this case to radio stations and television stations.
So just as a final point, I mean, if this legislation, this sort of revenue reimbursement model that the government is coming up with isn't the answer, they haven't negotiated sort of a central fund, as I believe has sort of happened in Australia to some degree, and then individual content agreements with the individual media companies. Is that where you think this needs to go? Do you think the CBC needs to cut a deal with Google, CTV, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, Canadian Press, they all need to cut individual deals? Is that the path forward? Because it seems like if the government pushes ahead, Google may very well just shut it all down rather than pay for business as usual.
I think that's the risk, and I think Facebook's probably right alongside that. Listen, some of the companies you just mentioned already do have deals with Google. So where there is that kind of use, I think there's been a recognition that payment is appropriate. I do think that this bill really does create some significant risks. We ought to have a significant rethink. And if we did move towards a fund to get to what I think the government's primary objective is, which is to ensure that we can fund journalism, we don't hurt the broader innovation ecosystem when it comes to new media companies. The government talks about many of the media companies that have shut down over the last decade. They don't talk about the hundreds that have also started up at the same point in time. And we want to ensure that government isn't itself so putting its thumb on things and making decisions about which will thrive and which won't. And a more neutral approach rather than the government so directly intervening and I think creating significant risks ultimately for all Canadians in terms of what our search ecosystem looks like, in terms of what social media looks like, really does require a bit of a rethink in terms of what C18 does.
Okay, Michael Geis, I really appreciate your insights and your time. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.